connections to New York, Paris, and Rome, and 48 flat screen TV, and my laptop. Like the prize value of the package is like $150,000 or something. Yeah, kind of like
Hey, so for you guys who don't know me, my name is Dan Bersak. I'm doing my thesis on ethics in photojournalism, the past, present, and future. Before I begin, I realized that I haven't seen a lot of you guys in the last few weeks, so the big piece of news in my life is I'm now engaged. It's actually kind of cool. So after I gave her the ring, a few days later, she gave me an engagement ring, which is kind of neat. So I'd never heard of that before. And so now I get to freak people out on the side on the road that they see me and you're married. What yet? All right.
I knew
so
it after the dog dance.
what?
After you get the dog together, I knew it.
Yeah.
That's a total commitment.
It is. Fred's doing well. So yeah, the title of my thesis is Ethics in Photojournalism, Past, Present, and Future. Before I go into it, I just wanted to detail a little bit of why photojournalism and ethics kind of interest me. I've been interested in photojournalism for a long time. I've been working in it professionally for about 5 years. And I wasn't ever really too concerned with ethics. It was always something that was kind of held over our heads as photojournalists. In the sense that I'll go into an example a little bit later about a guy who was working in Iraq, had an ethical breach, and was summarily fired, stripped out of Iraq, and on the next flight home from the middle of an active war zone because he ethically violated his newspaper's code of ethics. And so it's always been something that say, if you screw up, if you Photoshop an image, if you fake this, if you do that, if you do something wrong, you're going to be canned and fired, and you're never going to work in photojournalism again. So it was something that, as a working photojournalism, I had to be aware of, but I wasn't really concerned about it. And then some of you who were here last year remember that there was a riot after the Red Sox American League Championship Series win, and the Boston police ended up shooting a pepper ball at a college student and killing her. And I was standing right next to her, and I ended up getting the entire thing on film, and sent my film into my agency, and the next day it was put on the front page of the Boston Herald. And after that, all hell broke loose. It was the only time in my life I've ever gotten death threats, and I got them for 2 weeks straight, people calling up saying that they're going to come to my house and beat me bloody with a baseball bat and take pictures and send them to my family. It really, really riled people up. I had journalists contacting me saying that taking those photos was totally unethical. I had other journalists contacting me saying, bravo, it's great to see that you had the gumption to take those photos because other people wouldn't have. And it kind of left me questioning, well, what is the code of ethics in photojournalism, and how did it get to where it was? And I looked around kind of, on the web, and I looked in the library, and I looked all over the place, and nobody has really traced the history of ethics in photojournalism. Everyone knows what they are right now, and you can ask older photographers, well, what were they when you were shooting in the, in the 60s and the 70s? And they say, oh, well, we used to be able to do this, but we couldn't do that. No one has really connected all the dots and said, this is the timeline, this is the evolution, it used to be this, and then it was that, and then it was that. And then nobody has really taken, the time or the effort to extrapolate forward and look at the technologies that are coming down the pipe, and looking at the types of images that are running now, the types of editors that are coming in, and the types of situations that are developing, and say, well, ethics will have to adapt in the future to accommodate these situations. So that's what motivates me in writing this thesis. That said, when I first actually went to go put pen to paper, I had done a lot of research and I started writing, I was kind of hit with 5 major things that I had to define, which were ethics, photojournalism, past, present, and future. I started and I said, okay, well, I'm going to write this about, I know what journalistic ethics are, and I was just looking, okay, I'm just going to use somebody else's definition. Well, they're all over the map. Nobody has really had the definition of journalistic ethics. And in fact, there's a lot of infighting and people yelling at each other about what ethics in photojournalism really is. As far as ethics goes, everyone agrees that ethics is veracity, or at least has to do with the veracity or the truth or the accuracy of the photo. Is it accurately representing your subject? Is it fair to your subject? A lot of people will say, if you take a picture of the president and you Photoshop in a third eyeball, that's unethical. And that's a pretty black and white line that most people would say is a pretty clear ethical decision. The problem comes when you get to questions such as, what's a question of ethics and what's a question of taste? There are lots of people who say that the types of images that I took of bloody or gory, or things that are sexual in nature, that's an issue of taste. And if it tells the story, then it's not unethical to publish it, but it might be in bad taste. Other people say that that is an ethical situation, because what if the children see it, or what if it violates prevailing community standards? And so there's this back and forth in the photojournalism community about the boundaries, or what bounds ethics in general. I've sort of chosen to throw pretty much everything into the ethical pot. And I've actually drawn the line, or divided it up in a different way than pretty much everybody else. I'm looking at two types of ethics, which are photographer-centric ethics, meaning the ethics within the photographer at the time the photo was being made. And then institutional ethics, which are the kind of the bylaws and the guidelines and the things for, in the organization for which that photographer may work, or under which that photographer operates. And so if I'm an unethical photographer and I go and I pose somebody and make it look like something's happening that's not actually happening, that's an issue of photographer-centric ethics. If I'm an editor and I say, I won't run this photo because it's unethical, then that is institutional. And I'm looking at these two kind of parallel but intertwining lines through the past, present, and future. Which brings us to, well, what is photojournalism? You would think it would be pretty easy to define, seeing as I'm a photojournalist, I work in it. But as I went to go try and get a definition and nail that down, I realized that a lot of people are kind of wishy-washy on that as well. I went to a couple of different dictionaries. I know it's sophomore year high school, but it's really interesting to see that most of them define journalism itself as the profession of reporting or photographing or editing news stories for one of the media. Well, under that definition, the guy who edits together a photo of Bigfoot for the Weekly World News is on the same level a journalist as the guy who won the Pulitzer Prize for, say, the photo of the Oklahoma City bombing, the firefighter holding the baby. That guy, by the way, wasn't a professional photojournalist either. He was a utility worker who had his camera at the time. Is he a photojournalist? Is he a quote-unquote citizen photojournalist? Is that photojournalism, or is that a photo that just got sucked into the journalism system? It's hard to define. It's hard to nail down. And so, again, I'm kind of taking pretty much everything as photojournalism, if it's in magazines or newspapers, but I've decided to focus the scope of the thesis on American photojournalism in newspapers and magazines. And that makes it a little bit easier for me to write about, but still acknowledge that there are other things on the fringes or outside of that definition that still qualify as photojournalism. But, I would spend 100,000 pages detailing photos on blogs and still photos on TV news and photos in this context and that context, and different photographers have photo books. James Nachtwey is a famous photojournalist who has several books out on images from Africa and war zones and everything. Is that book a photojournalism? I've decided I'm not really going to get into that, and I'm going to look at newspapers and magazines. Well, that brings us to the past, which is, now we're getting into the chapters of my thesis. We have 3 chapters, past, present, and future. In the past chapter, I actually used a research method where I looked at the month of July for every month of the New York Times from 1880 all the way up to today. And I detailed the trends in photography, the trends in when things started to be flash lit or posed or unposed, when that died off and when it picked up again. Photography first started in the New York Times at around 1897, which were, there were 50 photos of Queen Victoria's Jubilee March published in the New York Times. It was hailed as a technological marvel that they could get 50 photographs from across the ocean and actually get them somehow into the paper, and people were amazed for, I'm sure, weeks on end. You look at yesterday's New York Times, where we have full bleed, full color photographs on the front, and then through half of the, through half of the newspaper. Obviously, the technology changed between then and between now. So I'm looking at the development of that, that technology, and looking at the ethics in between, or the development of the ethics as facilitated by the technology. I'm also looking at photographic technology, like cameras, lenses, flashes, when those start to emerge, not only when they're invented, but when they become popularly available, and how those affect ethical decisions. For example, if you think about an old-time camera, box camera, you have to stay still for a couple seconds to make an image. Well, then you can't take anything but posed imagery of human beings. So the ethical system has to accommodate that. If you have today's ethical standard where you say, use a news photographer can't go in and garden and clean up the scene and pose people and make it look like what's happening isn't actually happening, you can't really do that with a camera that takes a couple seconds to. You can't have that ethical consideration, is what I mean, with a camera where you have to pose. And so as we gain the ability to take candid photos, we lose the ability to pose people in terms of, in ethics. So brings us to present today. Originally, I was going to look at everything in the age of digital imaging, but it turns out that ethics have even shifted in that short time. And so I'm looking at ethics as they are right now, with a few years of slop, 1 or 2 years back. Otherwise, we get into the classic Spaceballs conundrum of we're looking at now, when, now. When was then? Just now. Looking at 2004, 2005, a little bit of 2003, in terms of ethical situations. And for these, I'm doing case studies, the major ones of which are the Abu Ghraib prison photos, as they were taken by non-professional or non-journalist photographers, yet run in almost every journalistic outlet known to mankind. I'm also looking at the case I hinted at earlier of a photographer named Brian Walsky, who was photographing over in Iraq. And he took 2 consecutive images of a Marine telling people to get down as there was an incoming mortar. And he liked the Marine on the left side of the frame in one frame. And he liked the expressions on the people's faces on the right side of the frame in the other frame. And so he took Photoshop and put them together in the field. These are 2 consecutive frames taken about 1/8 of a second apart. It just so happens that someone was walking through the background and appeared in both halves of the frame. And someone who with very sharp eyes saw this. Within about 36 hours of that discovery, Brian Walsky was out of the war zone on a plane back to Los Angeles. His cameras were taken back and he was jobless. It was done. They fired him on the spot over the satellite phone in the field, and he came back. And so looking at that particular situation and saying, well, a lot of journalistic ethics is about the truth and about representing the situation. Did Mr. Walsky misrepresent the situation? Did he lie to his readers as to what was happening? Why is there the need to be this draconian when it comes to ethics? The third example is I'm going to go into my own example, my photos from the Red Sox riot, how they were taken, how they were used, and whether or not it was ethical. you know, a little bit of autoethnography, as Castro called it. You know, one of the reasons that people got on my case so much and called me and were very unhappy was they thought that I was taking pictures instead of actually helping the girl who had been shot. And so I'm going to look at that and say, did I have an ethical call to help her? Did I have an ethical call to do my job as a photographer? Where does that stand? Let's see. Which brings us to the future. The issues I'm looking at in the future have a lot to do with time and a lot to do with the sheer quantity of images available to news editors. In the what they call the new media newsroom, there's really no such thing as a deadline anymore. You have a website. That website gets updated instantaneously as new images or new text or new content becomes available. And so what used to be in a news cycle, you used to have, you know, the bell that would ring in the newsroom and that would say everything has to go off to the printers now, otherwise we're not going to make the deadlines in the morning. There is no more bell. And so before, if you had an ethically questionable image, if you had an image that you think that the photographer might have faked or that there was some problem with it, you had time to, you know, maybe it was too violent or too sexual. You had time to gather a quorum of editors and talk about it and look at the photo and say, yes, this is okay, no, this is not. You could debate it. Now there's no time to do that anymore. There is no deadline. And so if your competitor decides that the photo's okay and scoops you, that's seen as a bad thing. And you know, it probably is. You lose a little bit of market share or you lose whatever. You can't say that you were the first with the image. In the news world, that matters. And so ethics is more and more being pushed to almost a knee-jerk reaction rather than a thought-out process that it used to be. With that happening simultaneously, editors are seeing more photos than they ever have before. People are carrying cameras in their pockets and cameras in cell phones and cameras in PDAs. And you know, you might be tempted to say, well, what's the big deal? After the Rodney King beating, we heard about how there was going to be no more videographers because everybody was going to have a video camera, and the video journalist was dead because you know everyone would have these cameras and we'd never see another professional video. And obviously, that's not true. I don't think it's true that we're never going to see another photojournalist either. The big difference is that a lot of the cameras, like the camera in my cell phone, is connected to a network. I have a mechanism to immediately upload that. The BBC is actively soliciting photos from readers and from viewers at events. And they have an email address or a number that you can text or send or MMS your photo to. And it's seen by their photo editors right alongside the major wire feeds, AP, Reuters, Getty, etc. And right alongside their own staff professional photographers. So now, not only are these editors trying to portray an event, you look at, for example, the London train bombings of last summer. You have, you know, 45, 50 photos from the Associated Press, 50 photos from Getty, 50 photos from Reuters, however many photos your staff photographers have, and then thousands of photos that you can find on the web and contact people and say, can I use this photo? As was done with Flickr. Many editors looked at Flickr and said, hey, you know, I'd like to use this photo, can I use this photo? Your photos, the sheer number of photos that a particular editor is seeing is increasing, while the time in which to decide whether or not they were taken under ethical standards or in an ethical manner, or whether or not you're being duped, is decreasing. Another example, I don't know how many of you guys are Apple fans or real hardcore dyed-in-the-wool Apple rumor people. But a few weeks ago, there was a rumor coming out that Apple was going to release their new video iPod. And there was a photo of the new video iPod. And it went on every technology blog site. It was published in a few newspapers. It was, you know, all one continuous touch screen, and it looked absolutely real. And a few days later, it came out that that photo was completely faked. A few days after that, there was a video of how they faked that photo. People who faked it actually made a video showing them taking photos of real iPods and cutting out screens and stitching them together and playing around with them. Well, that news that Apple was releasing an iPod actually made Apple's stock price fluctuate. It was amazing that these people with Photoshop and a digital camera could influence the stock price of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. So the issue of veracity, of whether a photo is true, whether it's telling you the truth, whether or not your leg is being pulled, not only has journalistic and ethical considerations, it has real financial, monetary considerations. And so as the software becomes more powerful, as the software becomes easier to use, you might see more and more people attempting to do that. So that's my thesis in a nutshell, past, present, and future. I'm going to open it up for questions. Yes.
I'm interested in what you said about time and technology and the duration it used to take to pose people. But I'm sort of interested in the opposite end of that, which is you as a photographer, because the technology makes, from what I seem to recall some of the stories you told about, like when this event at the Sox game actually happened, that you weren't necessarily, there was like this immediacy to the way you use the camera, that you're in the zone. And I'm wondering if there's if the technology to some extent, if that also affects the ethics. The fact that at this point, a lot of us are using technology in a really prosthetic kind of sense, where the immediacy of using it sort of subtracts from it being like a necessarily voluntary kind of act. Can you stop yourself, or is it something that you just do, and then since you just load the images and send them on to someone who's supposed to make robust decisions about them, who's responsible, how much, at what stage of that?
Well, as a system, at the present and certainly in the past, it was kind of a two-tiered ethical system, that you relied on the ethics of the photographer to create a sound image, and then the ethics of the editor to revise and to choose which one was best suited, the subject, etc. As the technology becomes more affordable and more approachable, you are seeing less experienced people in the role of photojournalists.
But there's like no moment where they're forced to the technological constraints to pause and have the opportunity to make a decision, right? It's all.
No, there is no tech. As you said, there's no moment where they're forced to pause and make those decisions. One instance where the technology is actually kind of influencing the ethics and back and forth. So one kind of arcane little ethical tidbit from photojournalism is it used to be said that anything that you could do in camera, as in without a darkroom, was pretty much almost always legal, or in terms of ethical, or okay under the system of ethics. And so you used to see these multiple exposures all the time, like a guy going over the high jump, you take a bunch with a motor drive. You can do that all on one piece of film. You develop that piece of film, you have all those images there. That was seen as ethical. Digital photography came about. There was no system of doing that digitally. It just doesn't make sense. You can take the individual pictures and put them together in Photoshop. That was deemed as unethical. So now Nikon has released, as of about 8 months ago, a camera where in camera you can take these multiple exposures and it will superimpose them in camera, no intervention from the photographer. That's deemed as ethical. And so the technology has actually gone forwards or backwards, however you want to look at it, in order to accommodate the ethical constraints of photojournalism. I don't know if that helps in illuminating your question, but it's kind of tangentially, almost sort of half related.
Yeah, I'm always interested in the way the technology sort of makes invisible the decisions we make along the way. Like, the easier the technology is, the more people start to actually sort of retrofit old technology onto it. Like the suddenly like music now has like pops and hisses recorded into it, and I see that. I'm kind of intrigued as to whether people are intentionally doing that to remind us that it's quote unquote real, as opposed to like the sort of those markers not existing in the digital.
So I see.
Dan, I have a question about the cultural boundaries of your definitions of ethics and photojournalism,
Sure.
especially given the kind of networked space that we live in, and the fact that we now have access to images from other cultural settings. Iraq is a really good example where we have the stuff that's available to us through the wire, the sort of officially vetted, the wire and the press, so vetted images that we see here in the States. And then we have Flickr where there are, I don't know how many thousands of pages of sort of diary photos from people in Iraq, from US people in Iraq usually. But then there's all those photos that someone like Robert Fisk will put on his site that always have little Arabic language taglines on them that are images that we'll never see in an American paper of sort of half of a baby or half of a face. Pictures that sort of put the war in a very, very different context than we've ever seen it here. Until now, probably those are pretty hard to get unless you read Arabic or manage to think about looking at it in an Arab language newspaper. But thanks to the web, that stuff is easily available, and even someone like this could plug it out. So how does that, in the terms of a future, how do you see that notion of globalization through through network technologies as affecting the borders of the cultural borders of ethics?
Well, in terms of the boundaries that I've lined for my thesis, in terms of magazine and newspaper photojournalism, I don't see it affecting it very much at all. The kind of the test as to whether something is too shocking or too grotesque for the front page of the newspaper is kind of nicknamed the Cheerios test. And is it going to make Grandpa spit out his Cheerios as he reads at the breakfast table in the morning? And it's and it's in every journalism classroom in America you'll find pass the Cheerios test, and that test is instituted because when you do have something that is shocking or is disturbing, you see a wave of people who cancel their subscriptions and another wave of people who rail against the paper and etc. And you don't actually end up gaining any money. And as journalism is a business, you actually have to get paying readers and paying viewers and eyeballs on your advertisements in order to make money. And if you are scaring them away, and if mom is saying, I don't want my kids to see half a baby on the front of the newspaper, so I'm not going to buy your newspaper anymore, then you're not doing yourself any kind of a service. In terms of global awareness of these things, I think the web is helping quite a bit in the form of viral messaging and viral people forwarding things. I just got a slideshow, a PowerPoint slideshow emailed to me about a week ago with certain things from Iraq, the photos that you're not seeing. I wouldn't have seen those otherwise, if they hadn't been forwarded to me.
So I guess then the question is, how does the Cheerios effect map onto ethics? Because that would seem to be a third parameter, which is what makes good business sense. Just like what's legal is maybe another. These are related domains, but they're not really the same domain as ethics.
True. It's hard. It's a really fine line to tread. It's one of those things where most newspapers will look after number one first, and so if it comes down to saying, we really should show this photo, but it's just too bloody, they won't show the photo. It's just as simple as that. They don't want to lose subscribers, and they don't want to lose readers. And so, yes, the money certainly does have an impact on ethical decisions like that, but then you can get someone coming out of left field and saying, well, that's not a decision about ethics, that's a decision about taste. Yeah, I see.
I wanted to ask about your present category. Why did you choose those three representations, and do they kind of map to like a larger area of interest, and was there anything that you left out?
There's a lot that I left out. I chose those because as I've decided to carve ethics into photographer-centric and institutional, those three examples, the Abu Ghraib is a great way of looking at institutional ethics because there were no photographer-centric ethics. Those were just people who weren't even photojournalists. They weren't thinking about journalistic ethics at the time. They were taking snapshots. Those photos were magically dumped on the doorstep of a journalistic entity, and then whatever happened to them, the ethical system started from there. So it's almost like a laboratory for institutional ethics that you see these photos magically appear midway in the chain, and you can look. The Brian Walsky one I've looked at because he copped to it, he admitted to what he did, and so there's a very clear description of what happened. And so you very rarely get to see someone who says, I was in the field, I did this, I did that, I now see it as ethically wrong, it was right for me to be fired, and I'm sorry. My own personal example, number one, I can speak about it with a little bit of authority. But number two, it straddles both. It allows me to address what did I do in the field and what should I have done in the field. And it also allows me to look at how my photos were used and whether or not they were used in an ethical manner. And so those three examples, I think, allow me to kind of move about that space that I've carved for myself.
Kind of personal institution and a mix of each.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see.
I love the, like, how you know about these things, like the Cheerios rule. And I'm wondering, like, if you, in your thesis, do you kind of investigate where these come from and how they're taught, like, in terms of schools or in the workplace, and what are the implications in the future for these citizen journalists who don't necessarily, so they aren't subscribing to the same code of ethics, or they aren't aware of the same ethics?
Well, for the second part first, in the future, I make the case that the institutional ethics is what's going to not necessarily take over, but certainly take a much, much larger play or a piece of, of the ethical action, so to speak, because you're going to be getting these images from so many more people and so many different, with a different range of ethical, stands, and even, two people who are both trying to be ethical can have very different ideas of ethics. And so, you throw all of that into a mix along with people who are actively trying to dupe you, like the people who made the iPod thing, and you see that the institutional, it's going to fall on the editor to actually try and be the, the valve or the regulator of what is ethical and what isn't. In terms of looking at how ethics are taught, yes, I've got a number of journalistic textbooks that I've gone through. I've got syllabi from photojournalism programs at different schools, and so I'm detailing what's taught where, and how people come to know these random things. Ilya, and then
do you think that the reaction, the public reaction, would have been different if the pictures of the killed student was taken not by you, but somebody, with a camera, full amateur camera, posted on Flickr? Do you think the angle would be attracted the channel in a different direction?
I think so. I mean, I think a lot of people are generally angry at the media for no real discernible reason. They're just kind of mad. And so, yeah, I think that I caught a lot of that people see, that it was a good way of saying the big bad media is so big and so bad that they didn't even help this student as she lay dying on the sidewalk. And I think that if it had been taken by somebody and posted to Flickr and gotten out through those channels, it would have been a lot better received. Yeah, I agree. So.
I have a couple questions. The first one is I'm wondering why you chose the month of July to focus on. It was just random, or if it has some significant historical.
I wanted, originally, it ended up making no difference. When I originally chose it, I thought, well, there's a US holiday in the month of July, and it's not too near anything, like if I were to choose, for example, November, every 4 years I would be seeing a glut of coverage of presidential elections, but then every 3 years, and so I wanted to try and even it out a little bit. And originally I was kind of looking and seeing, okay, well, maybe every July I might get fireworks pictures and I might be able to do something with how they cover the 4th of July, but other than that, July is a pretty dull month. And so it's really going to be left up to the local news, the murders, the human interest stories, the national things of whatever's happening. And it's not going to be swamped by election day or, even back in the 1800s, Christmas stretched, 3 weeks before and after actual Christmas.
Yeah.
And so you choose the month of December, and, December 10th, December 11th, you start seeing the, all sorts of different stuff in terms of covering that.
My next question was going back to these 3 categories you chose, past, present, and future. not even that, so much as looking at notions of ethics and taste. How do you get around the fact that, you know, the high and low issues in terms of taste, like what was considered tasteless in, say, the Victorian era is probably considered completely harmless by today's standards. So certainly probably wouldn't be as big a breach of ethics as, say, the photos that you took.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of this case that we discussed in William's class, the Kodak case where the woman was photographed. Just, I think her neck, you know, was something very subtle was showing. That versus the way you photographed the young girl that was killed. Like, the reaction obviously would be very different in those times. So how do you know, work around the idea of notions of taste are very different, and even in specific time periods, notions of taste and what's ethical are going to vary amongst different groups and classes and cultures. So what point of reference are you grabbing at, and how do you get around that very
The biggest mechanism that I'm using is I'm looking at an entire month worth of newspapers for every single year. And so if you use that kind of as your base and you see any standout images, that right there tells you that maybe it was something that was pushing a boundary. And so, you know, you look at 30 days worth of the New York Times, and you're going to find one picture in one of them that you kind of go, hey, that guy looks a little stiff, and it's 1982. Was he posed? And you go and you do some digging, and you realize, yeah, that photographer was well known for posing people, and he just decided, you know, and was that an ethical breach at the time? Because the guy was, you know, he started working, you know, in the time when you used the big cameras where you had to pose, you know, so. That's at least the way mechanism I use to identify those particular images. I do discuss changing, you know, prevailing community standards, but there's really no metric, there's no easy way of actually objectively measuring that and saying, okay, well, this is, you know, 3 units beyond the community standard.
You know, because I wonder whose standards are you judging by? The editorial standards? Is it the popular taste, or is it a particular? I mean, the community surrounding the Fenway incident is going to have a much different taste than, you know, another community who would be equally horrified, but might not have, you know, taken as much offense to you, or, you know, might have seen you more. And that leads to my third question. When you took that photo, were you conscious of who you were at that moment? Were you a photojournalist at that moment, or were you a citizen?
Well, for the second thing, the only thing that can really help is the link, the monetary link, that ultimately readers are also subscribers usually, and they're actually paying for it. And so you can't go too far beyond where the community wants you to be, otherwise you lose your readership. In terms of when I took the photo, I was a photojournalist. I was out there to cover the event, and that's what I did. Subsequently, after I had gotten my images, I actually did go over and try to help her, and I was held back by the police. And so, you know, you can make of that what you will. But
I was curious. I didn't mean to. I'm not.
Oh, no, no, no.
judgment anymore.
No, absolutely. You know, in terms of my own ethical choice, I was lucky that I had taken a class where we had discussed similar situations before, and we had looked at the Vietnam photographers who used to hop out of the helicopters and help carry the wounded soldiers in without taking a single frame, and ask, well, you know, did they owe something to their publication? You know, they're out there to take pictures, they're not out there to carry soldiers. It's in a war zone, you can carry as many soldiers as you want. You know, they're being, you know, shot all the time. You know, that's what a war is. And so really, if you decide I'm a photographer, I'm going to carry every wounded soldier I see, you're not going to be taking too many pictures.
Right.
So, you know, how do you make those ethical decisions? And I had already thought about that, and I'd already...
Are you looking at a lot of, because Vietnam brought a lot of those issues out there, because there's so many photos of a lot of the destruction that was happening.
yeah, there's a
There's
lot.
a guy behind the camera who gets shot. And
A lot of Vietnam.
Yeah. So,
The other question about posing, I mean, that's clearly, you know, clearly arranging things is, if the photography does it, does seem to be problematic these days. But we also know we're in Iraq has been a wonderful example of, and this presidency has been a wonderful example of of in fact arranging things for the press and allowing the press only to see things from such a delimited view. So embedded journalism would be an example, but in photography, of course, it's the mission accomplished shot of a boat docked in San Diego Harbor, where photographers were, I think, forbidden
To turn
from
around.
shooting
Yeah.
the shot in a way that would show that this thing was in the dock. They had to shoot it so it looked like it was at sea. Why isn't that, I mean, why is that, there's an ethical judgment there, like whether you play along with this faking of the image in a way, or at least posing of, this is a pose thing, or whether do you play along with it and take the shot, or do you say, sorry?
Actually, I really considered using that very example, but that gets me a little bit more into the tie between money and ethics than I wanted to. If I took on that example, I would have to spend another 50, 60 pages going into, that's solely a monetary thing. It is if the White House, I'm not saying that they did, but if they did threaten and say, if you take this picture, we're yanking all the credentials for your newspaper, you're not going to cover anything here, they'd lose readers. That would be a huge monetary
Right,
blow.
so the other choice is not to cover it.
So the other choice is not to cover it, and they can do the same thing. I mean, if the New York Times doesn't show up to cover a White House event, something is seriously wrong.
But this is where profession-wide ethics are so crucial, because if the profession says, sorry, this is posed, and you take this and you're in breach of our professional ethics, then the White House can't play that game anymore.
I think if they had a week or a month to kick it around and come to a decision, that might have been the decision they came to. But I think that the actual situation was when they got on the boat, they were told what to do. And then afterwards, it was kind of just not necessarily sour grapes, but it had already happened. And so, I don't think they actually sent out a memo saying, at this thing we're having next week, you're not going to be able to do this, that, and the other thing.
Well, but they walk through, I know from working with the embassy in Holland, that they, in fact, they put like X marks on the sidewalk where the president will stand, and they'll tell the photographers what lens to use and where to stand so that they'll get a shot of the president and there'll be a nice scenic thing in the background, and this is a good shot for the front page. It's totally scripted, those presidential walkthroughs. He's going to stop here and shake a hand or hold a baby, and they literally put a tape mark on the ground, and they have a script book that they give the photographers that says, you're here, and these are the lens choices that we recommend.
Those they're recommendations. They're not actual, But
it goes exactly to this.
if you're being herded around in a press and herded into a little area, then those work themselves out on their own. In the sense that there is only one lens that you can use to make a certain picture from a certain standpoint, and I think that that's more an issue of public education and kind of truth in advertising. It would be nice if people were more aware that these were set up, situations. As for the ethics of the individual photographers who play along, I don't think that you can really call their ethics into question. Their hands are being forced. I mean, if you ask them, all of them would much rather be free and say, you have the run of the place, you can take any picture you want. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And so, it would certainly be nice to see publications start talking about the process of making photos. I don't know if they're actually ever going to do that. Ilya.
Kind of follow up to Len's question. How do you, what would you say about the concept of truth and in advertising, like photojournalism in this case, and the choice of angles and the choice of captions? And I'll give an example. You have a demonstration on the street, and you have a choice to take it, from the bar, and it's 100 people, so you can either take, come close and take, face-on shot, and it would look like, 2,000 people. You can climb on the building and shoot it as a very small group of people. And then, since you're typing your own captions, how would you go about describing it?
Well, in terms of getting into the ethics of the captions, you try to be as accurate as possible. When I cover demonstrations, I ask several police officers for the estimates that they get, and they always vary wildly, and so you have to kind of do a little bit of averaging. But if they're saying there's about 1,500 people here, as long as you put it in the caption that you do that one portrait of that one passionate protester, and then you do the other shot of the whole thing, as long as both captions say this is a protest of 1,500 people, then I think that you're in the clear. If you lie in the caption, or if you take the photo so as to misrepresent the number of people, You can't actually, with a long lens, you can compress things, and you can actually make small groups look like they're much bigger sometimes. And you do that intentionally, that might be an ethical breach, but then you get into what people are thinking at the time that they're taking the photo. And so it's a little bit hard to nail that down and say that you did this deliberately as an ethical breach.
That actually, my question is a follow-up to what you just said. Do you sense that there's a large disparity between public ethics and code of ethics and practical ethics? And it seems that with your example from the Times, it's not so much that he photoshopped the image that was the ethical breach, but that he photoshopped it poorly. Because he obviously didn't think twice about doing it, he just didn't do it well enough so that we wouldn't notice. So I mean, it's probably going on a lot more than just this. And so how much do you get the feeling that people are, really adhering to a professional code of ethics, or just giving lip service to it and just trying to get around it?
I think at the top levels, when you start photographing for big news agencies, big newspapers, big magazines, ethics are very important because it's more about the risk of being discovered. One thing, when they photoshopped Martha Stewart's head onto somebody's body while she was still in prison, put it on the front cover page of Newsweek, they tried to get around the ethics by saying photo illustration in tiny little letters. But they photoshopped it so well that you really wouldn't be able to tell that it wasn't Martha Stewart except for the fact that she was still in jail. And so there was outrage and there was outcry, and they got a lot of negative reaction. And so Newsweek kind of said, mea culpa, we'll never do that again until the next time they do it again. I think perhaps if you get down to local photojournalism, I mean, I can't speak for every community newspaper, photographer, et cetera. I mean, there may be some that are consistently shirking or flaunting the ethics. But I know that when you get up into the professional, the real big ranks of the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, when you get into Time, Newsweek, when you get into foreign media, which I'm not really talking about in my thesis, but Perry Match, Der Spiegel, those don't mess around because as much as it is a growing industry, it's still a good old boy handshake industry, and there are a lot of editors who will talk to other editors and say, you know, this guy's a bad egg, don't use his stuff.
Right, we're
Right now, next to pharmaceutical.